Sahapaneshu Apateshu Mukhi Bhagavata Sevaya Bhagavati Dhamashloke Bhakti Darashina Stiti. Reading from the Srimad Bhagavatam, 2nd Canto, 9th chapter, texts number 11 and 12. Is that right? Shamavadata, Shata, Patra, Lochanaha, Prasanga, Vastrai, Vastraha, Surucha, Supeshasaha, Sarve, Chatur, Bhava, Mishan, Mani, Pravekya, Nishkaburanya, Suvarnaha, Samavadis Shatapatra Lochanaha, Samavastram Surya Supeshvaha, Chaturbaha Unmashmani, Vabeha Nishka Babarana Suvarnaha. Sky bluish, Advadahata, glowing, Shatapatra, Lochanaha, eyes, Vishanga, yellowish, Vashtra, clothing, Suracha, greatly attractive, Supashasa, growing youthful, Sarve, all of them, Chatuhu, four, Bahavaha, hands, Unmishan, rising luster, Mani, pearls, Vaveka, superior quality, Nishka Abhavarana, ornamental medallions, Suvarachahasa, effulgence. The inhabitants of Vaikuntha planets are described as having a glowing sky bluish complexion. Their eyes resemble lotus flowers, their dress is of yellowish color, and their bodily features very attractive. They are just the age of growing youth. They all have 4 hands. They are all nicely decorated with pearl necklaces with ornamental medallions, and they all appear to be effulgent. Responsibly, the inhabitants of the Vaikuntha planets are described as having a glowing sky bluish complexion. Their eyes resemble lotus flowers. Their dress is of yellowish color. And their bodily features very attractive. They are just the age of growing youth. They all have 4 hands. They are all nicely decorated with pearl necklaces. With ornamental medallions. And they all appear to be effulgent. Purport by Srila Prabhupada. The inhabitants of Vaikuntha Lokas are all personalities with spiritual bodily features not to be found in the material world. We can find the descriptions in the revealed scriptures like Srimad Bhagavatam. Impersonal descriptions of transcendence in these scriptures indicate that the bodily features of Vaikuntha Loka are never to be seen in any part of the universe. As there are different bodily features in different places of a particular planet, or as there are different bodily features between bodies in different planets, similarly, the bodily features of the inhabitants in Vaikuntha Loka are completely different from those in the material universe. For example, the 4 hands are distinct from the 2 hands in this world. Text 12. Pravala vidurya minalam varchasaham harish purad kundala mola malinam pravala coral vidura, a special diamond, minala, celestial lotus, varchasaham, rays, Harishpura, blooming. Kundala, blooming. Mali, heads. Malina, with garlands. Translation: some of them are effulgent, like coral and diamonds in complexion, and have garlands on their heads, blooming like lotus flowers, and some wear earrings. Purport by Srila Prabhupada. There are some inhabitants who have attained the liberation of sarupya, or possessing bodily features like those of the personality of Godhead. The Vaidurya diamond is especially meant for the personality of Godhead. The one who achieves the liberation of bodily equality with the Lord is especially favored with such diamonds on his body. Text 11, translation again. The inhabitants of Vaikuntha planets are described as having glowing sky bluish complexion. Their eyes resemble lotus flowers, their dress is of yellowish color, and their bodily features very attractive. They are just the age of growing youth. They all have 4 hands. They are all nicely decorated with pearl necklaces with ornamental medallions, and they all appear to be effulgent. Om Agyanati Mirandasya Gananjana Salakaya Chakshur Militam Dina Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Mukam Karoti Vachalam Pangam Mangaya Tegir Yatri Pataraham Bande Shri Guru Dinacharane. It's mentioned here that the inhabitants of Vaikuntha Loka have 4 hands or 4 arms. They have to have arms to connect the hands to the shoulders. It's actually beyond scientific explanation. We were reading the book called Alien Identity by Sadhguru, or Parallels is the new title, picked by Sadhguru himself, supposedly. And he was saying that that people who have 4 arms and only 1 shoulder operate in a very different fashion from what we experience in the material world. They can move their arms, 2 arms, from 1 shoulder very fluidly, as if they only have 1 arm. So this is beyond the laws of scientific approach. And people like, there were many people, who decided there were laws of physics, laws of gravity, laws of thermodynamics, and so on. And the physicists of the world all think that these are laws. They are incontrovertible. They exist. And anything that appears to be some... Sorry? The rain is a bit loud. Anyway, I hope you can hear it. If you can't hear it, anyways, we were talking about how if anything violates the law, like in alien identities, there were descriptions of reports of unidentified flying objects which could move at speeds greater than speeds that we know, speeds that are 1,800 miles per hour, speed of light or something like that. And they could tilt and they could take off and they could move in ways that were unexplainable by modern physics. And there are many reports, even by Air Force pilots, experiencing these things. And some were not so schooled in aerodynamics. But nonetheless, there were many reports. And the conclusions were that if these so-called reports didn't pose threats to national security, there were reports in the USA, we should not worry about them because they're just checking things. There was a program called Taken. It was aired in the United States. It was a weekly thing. I think Steven Spielberg produced it. And it was all about people who were taken as hostage by beings from supposedly other planets. And they sat around, they had a kind of group therapy session. They had several group therapy sessions. And they tried to explain to one another why these things happen and how they could get away with them without traumatizing them. So apparently there's some reality to things that are unexplainable by science. In England there was a magazine, it's not published any longer, called, I used to get it, called The Unexplained. And there was a phenomenon called spontaneous internal combustion, which is unexplainable also by science. And it cataloged an incident where a man and wife a man and woman were about to be married, and according to the internal spontaneous combustion system, they went alight and they just vanished, and there was nothing left but their shoes. And this took place in front of a whole congregation full of people, and the priest and everyone. So there were instances of fishes raining down from the sky and many other unexplained phenomena that modern science can't explain. So one of the great challenges that Prabhupada had was to take modern science to account. And one thing that is understandable by physics is that something can be both, and Sadhguru explains this in one of his books, something can be flat and round at the same time. And by understanding higher mathematics, we can actually understand that there's such a thing as Bhumandala, which is a flat surface, and there's roundness or spherical shapes to this planet. And even though Prabhupada himself knew, because he had flown a lot of airplanes, he could fly in the western direction from Los Angeles, you'll eventually get to India. But he also knew that there was another dimension, higher dimension, that was hard to explain by modern physics and modern astrological physics. Astronomy was called astrological physics at one time because it seemed to be a little bit more explicit. But again, there were many things that couldn't be explained. And Prabhupada had many people come to his quarters in 1976, 1977, astronomers who had mapped the structure of the universe according to the Vedic system, such that if you, for example, fly in an airplane from Los Angeles in the western direction, you'll eventually come to India, which is one thing that devotees and Prabhupada have experienced. But it's not always true. There's a flat dimension to the material world. And even diagrams have been made showing that the universe is not heliocentric or sun-centric, which we learn in astronomy classes, but that it's geocentric or earth-centric. And all the planets orbit around the Earth, not exactly in circles, but in kind of an unusual figure, like it's a sort of circle with curlicues in it. But it does happen, and there's a time when it was actually thought that the Earth was flat. debunk that system by saying, like people like Magellan and Columbus, by traveling in a certain direction and finding out that there was a roundness to the world, and that became the physical truth. So there are many things that we read about that seem to be unbelievable or illogical and unexplainable by physics and chemistry. One of them is how people can have four hands and four arms and operate them just as we operate one hand or two hands from the shoulders. And I think someone mentioned in one of the classes that all this stuff to us, to many people, sounds very fantastic, sounds very much invented, or it's like a fantasy or a fiction. And from what I was told, sometimes we hear that so many people were killed in the battlefield of Kurukshetra, or Nanda Maharaj had hundreds of thousands of cows, and Lord Chaitanya had the effulgence of millions of suns, things like that. We read about constantly. And at one point, one devotee challenged Prabhupada. He said, well, how can we think these things are real? Are they not the writers taking a sort of poetic license and making it sort of exaggerating a little bit on reality? And the response, and I think it was mentioned in one of the classes by Prabhupada, was, do you think I've come all the way from India to tell you fairy tales? Because they're not fairy tales, they're real. The spiritual world is a real world. It's a world where there's no anxiety, no difficulty, no death, and we don't experience anything like this in the material world. So it's a very very different world. Sometimes devotees have ventured into this other world, of the spiritual world, and then come out of it thinking the material world is better. And one instance is of a person whose name I probably shouldn't mention, who was on a traveling party. And he customarily distributed books to people. This is a true story. And he would sign the books that he gave people. Well, at some point, this devotee had left sort of frontline Krishna consciousness, and at one point he began hitchhiking. And it so happened that a hitchhiker picked him up. And they got to talking, and this person who I'm talking about was a little bit philosophical. So somehow or other the conversation gravitated towards Bhagavad Gita, and that was the topic of discussion. And the person driving the car who collected the man said, oh, Bhagavad Gita, I think I have that book. I think I read it. I think I have it with me in my glove compartment of my car. And he reached into the glove box, he opened up the glove box, reached in and pulled out a Bhagavad Gita. And he said, is this the book that you're talking about, what we've been discussing? And he handed it to the devotee, or ex-devotee, or frontline devotee. And he looked at it, he said, yes, this is the very book. And he looked a little closer at the book. And then he saw, at the front of the book, his own signature, his name appeared. And it turned out that the guy who was driving the car got the book from this person that he picked up. And he signed the book over to him. But the person who was hitchhiking didn't reveal anything about that it was him who gave the book to him, because he didn't want the driver to know that he had stopped being a frontline devotee at the time. So that really happened. And then what happened was that the devotee who got picked up realized that Krishna was everywhere, and that you can't get away, even if you start hitchhiking or something like, you go very far away from Krishna consciousness, you can't abandon it. It comes back. And as a result, he came back into frontline preaching, and he's a very active frontline preacher these days. That's a true incident that someone sent me. I think it was part of the Memories series. It's a new one. It may not be in Memories books now, but it will be in there shortly. And there's another a similar story that actually occurred. This one was in New Zealand. I think it was around 1982 or thereabouts. And I won't mention his name because he probably doesn't want to be talked about. But a devotee was in the supermarket, and he came back to his car to drive away. And in his car were 5 very muscly, tattooed-looking, rough-looking guys of said very politely to these Maori guys, they said, I think there's been some mistake here. This is my automobile that you're sitting in. And the head Maori gang member, leader, had his feet up on the dashboard, and he said, and he was chewing gum, and he just kind of said, well, nothing. He didn't say anything. And it was like they were going to steal his car. They were going to take his car away. And then they got to talking, and he said, well, I've been reading, and from the philosophy I've read, that if something doesn't belong to you, you shouldn't apprehend it. And he said, what's that book? And he said, well, that's the Bhagavad Gita. And then the guy the leader of the clan, with his feet up on the dashboard, said, the Bhagavad Gita, I've seen that somewhere. And he reached into the glove box, and there was the Bhagavad Gita. And then he said to his mates, he said, Bhagavad Gita. He said, and then they looked at the guy who was coming for his car, and he said, are you a Hare Krishna? And he said, well, actually, yes, I am. And then he said, oh, then he said, Hare Krishnas, they were very friendly to my people. They fed them when they were destitute. He said, okay, boys, out of the car. And that was the end of that. And he got in his car and drove away, thinking that I can never escape from Krishna, even though it looks like things are very dismal. And there's a little backstory. I think one of the devotees told me this about Luke, Radha Girihari, that he went to Tasmania. The backstory is that he had a property down in Tasmania next to his father's property. The two properties were adjacent. And I think I got this right. And he decided to sell his property. He didn't want it any longer. He thought, well, I will just move into where my father's property is, because my father wants to practice Krishna consciousness in the rest of his life. And so they got to talking, and one of the first people who responded to this sale, the property was on the market, said to him, actually, I don't want this property for myself, but I've sort of got involved in the Krishna movement, and I think that I just want to get away from the hustle and bustle of life, and I think we're going to just chill out in this property. And they got to talking, and then Luke told him, or Girihari told him, that he said, well, it's interesting you say that, because I'm a Hare Krishna too, and I'm actually calling you, I'm actually talking to you I'm living in the Hare Krishna farm. So they talked for some time and became friends, and the property was sold, and they finally agreed that the buyer was going to apprehend the property, and that Girihari was going to move onto his father's land and create a temple there, along with the guy the buyer who bought the adjacent property. Did I tell that right? I think that's what happened. Anyway, so the story has an interesting ending. That's the little backstory we kind of I heard that he had some relatives in Tasmania and then he was moving down there, but I didn't know all this stuff. It was kind of interesting. Anyway, getting back to the verse, it talks about the inhabitants of Vaikuntha Loka. Some of them are very special. They have special bodily features, and they have unusual complexions. Like we think of a blue complexion is impossible, but there are such things as people with bluish complexions, and they wear necklaces of pearls, and they wear special diamonds. We think diamonds are very valuable, and they are, in a sense, that one of the hardest, I think they are the hardest substance in the world. But they're very special, and of course the beers made them more special. They're really a colorless stone. They're not like rubies and emeralds that have red and green color. So they were considered kind of like useless stones. They were hard, and they're used for sandpaper and things like that. But it's described that the residents that they're very valuable now, and residents of Vaikuntha, they wear special diamonds in their entourage, in their clothing. So Krishna is very valuable, and Radharani is very valuable. And as we read in Govinda Lilamrita by Krishnadas Kaviraj, they had special, unusual ways of relating with one another. And these are nothing like the relationships between people, especially young boys and young girls in the material world, the relations in the material world are like likened to iron, and the relations in the spiritual world are likened to gold. They're completely different, and they should never be, according to what we read in Prabhupada's books, never be equated as being the same, because they're completely different. So that's the spiritual world. And many people think that devotees are escaping to the spiritual world because it's a world of like it's heavenly. It's everything is perfect. There's no death. There's no unhappiness. It's not real. So one has to understand that there is a reality to what seems to be a dream world or a fictitious world, a world that does not exist. That's the spiritual world, and that's Vaikuntha. And of course, there are different levels. There's Vaikuntha and there's Krishna Loka. And as one devotee was saying to me today, that in deeper studies, that the people who worship non-human species in Vaikuntha can attain that kind of a body, be it a butterfly or a mosquito or whatever. It's possible to obtain that kind of a body. So, according to our desire, and Krishna says, "Ye tamam prabhadyante tam tataiva bhajamayam." As they approach me, I reward them accordingly. So, even though we think it's very unfortunate that a person takes the body of a hog or a pig and relishes the taste of stool, or takes the body of a tiger and relishes the taste of fresh blood, all these things are actually Krishna's mercy. They're a form of Krishna's developing happiness. Because a pig is very happy to eat stool, and a tiger or a crocodile is very happy to eat fresh blood. It's very blissful. It's fun. And the difference between a human being and a non-human being in the spiritual world is radical. It's a very great difference. Sometimes a gross example is given how a cat or a dog, especially a cat, can pick up a kitten by the nape of its neck, and the kitten feels the love of the mother as very warm and comforting. At the same time, one of the killer cats, like a lion or a tiger, picks up an animal by the neck, and it feels like it's the jaws of death. So they do the same thing, but they're different in the material world. So in the spiritual world, we can experience something that seems somewhat similar to what we experience in the material world, but it's not. It's completely different. And that's the spiritual world, and that's what we're talking about here. I think I'll read the verse again because it's relevant. The inhabitants of the Vaikuntha planets are described as having a glowing sky bluish complexion. Their eyes resemble lotus flowers. Their dress is of yellowish color, and their bodily features very attractive. They are just the age of growing youth. They all have 4 hands. They are all nicely decorated with pearl necklaces, with ornamental medallions, and they all appear to be effulgent. In text 12 translates as, "Some of them are effulgent like coral and diamond in complexion, and have garlands on their heads, blooming like lotus flowers, and some wear earrings." So I think I'll stop there. If there's any further comments or questions on anything that I've said or read, please speak up. Last chance. I'll wait for a few minutes for people to gather their thoughts. Yes.
Thank you for the class, Marge. I just thought it was very interesting how you explained how the 2 arms came out of the shoulder, because I've never heard that. I always wondered, how it worked. So I still don't exactly know, but I always thought maybe, I don't know, there was 2 shoulders. I don't know.
Well, I had never heard of it either, but when a mathematician, Sadhguru, who has a PhD in mathematics from Cornell, explained it, that it's actually beyond physical explanation how you can have 2 arms and 1 shoulder, and they kind of move through each other, and it actually exists. So there are many things like that exist in the spiritual world that are beyond our physical understanding, and we should study these things or hear about them continuously to know that they exist, and they appear to be unreal, but they're actually real, even though we can't comprehend how they work. Yes?
So those people that don't believe these stories, are there things that we can say to try and help them get more faith in the spiritual life and the stories?
That's probably one of the most difficult things for people to understand, because a spiritual world where there's no death, no unhappiness, no old age, it's very difficult. So, according to realization, as is mentioned in the first canto, I think it's in the 4th chapter, it's a purport that one speaks according to realization, that when someone first comes to Krishna consciousness, they may be a meat eater, they may be engaged in all kinds of sinful activities like Jakaima died. They were even, according to some accounts, they were even murderers. But they were blessed by Krishna and forgiven, and eventually they came to understand the most difficult aspects of reality. And even though Prabhupada said that in Chaitanya Charitamrita, which was written when he was in the U.S. in the 1970s, even though Lord Chaitanya never discussed the intimate pastimes between Radha and Krishna, except with a very few intimate associates, and he just discussed Vedanta philosophy with people who were immersed in impersonalism or neophytes or totally ignorant of Krishna consciousness. He said that there is a time, there is a place, and there is a situation where everything can be said. He once quoted the Bible that said that, I think it's in Matthew, that said that Christ says that I have many things to say, but I'm not saying them now. Okay? Anything else? We'll end it. Thank you. Hare Krishna. Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.
So,